Good day, everybody. This is Bradley Nelson. I'm here with my co-host, Tom Davies, and we're here with Pharmland. And where Pharmland is here to serve up the freshest pharmacy information and insights to benefit advisors, employers, and anyone else, for that matter, looking for a better understanding of the industry. And what we'll do is we'll take the biggest topics, dig deep, offering perspectives that you will not find anywhere else. And as always, Pharmland is brought to you by Farm to Table, educational program from RX Benefits. Tom, how you doing, man?
Doing well. Podcast 9. Can you believe it?
Yeah, already podcast 9. And we've gone deep on a lot of different things, Tom. So we spent a good bit of time on GLP-1s, and then we've kind of migrated to some of the more the weighty information, the operational items that you can potentially experience when running a pharmacy benefit. I think the last couple of episodes, we spent a good bit of time discussing why things cost the way they do, the different mechanics and things of that nature. And so I think it's interesting what we're going to talk about today, because a lot of what we see in the marketplace is that drug development is what drives most of the cost today. That's why things cost so much, right? We spend all this money and time and effort to bring you the life-saving medications that we're bringing to the table for you. So
at least that's the intent, right?
Yeah, that's the intent. So everybody, Tom is one of those guys that I really respect, because he gets into the clinical trial information, really diving deep. And so we just discussed, you know what, maybe we need to dispel some of these myths on whether or not the drug development process, what is it? Is it driving up drug costs, or is it driving positive outcomes? What are all the puts and takes in terms of getting a drug to market? So this is what we're going to talk about today, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. I know I will. So Tom, here's my question overall for all of us to think about. How do pharma companies decide what new medications should really be in their pipeline?
That's a multi-layered question, and I'm hopeful that we're able to answer this question throughout our discussion today. But I think it's important for us to do a little bit of foundational work, right? And maybe start with the core body that's responsible for reviewing and approving drugs. And so I had to dive back into my first year pharmacy school notes to remember way back.
You still have those?
Didn't have a tablet. It was all written in a notebook.
That's good.
But looking at kind of how did the FDA come to be the FDA that we know today? So there was a lot of work that was done in the early 1900s with regards to the stepping stones to where we're at today with the drug approval process associated with the FDA. So I think it's interesting to take a step back and get an idea of exactly where it started. We had a lot of medications that were available in the mid 1800s that were being given without any information associated with actually what was in the medication. So there was one medication in particular that they called a patent medication, which didn't require any safety or efficacy analysis at the time, that really led to the first step in the formation of the FDA. And that medication was Miss Wilson's Soothing Syrup. It was a medication.
Sounds wonderful.
It sounds fantastic, does it not?
It does. I would love that today.
It would treat dysentery. It would treat fussy babies. It would treat babies going through the pains of teething. It would do a variety of different things associated with the advertisements when it came to this medication. However, there was no declaration of what was actually contained within this soothing syrup for babies.
So what made it soothing?
What made it soothing was the morphine content.
Hey, that's
there was
wonderful.
65 milligrams of morphine in every ounce of this medication. Morphine, ammonia, and alcohol is what was in this particular product. No wonder it led to non-fussy babies. If we think about my toxicology background, the dose of morphine that is used in infants less than 6 months of age, so infants that ultimately be teething, is about 4 milligrams. 1 teaspoon of soothing syrup had more than 4 milligrams in it. 1 teaspoon is potentially a toxic dose. And so that was really the formation of the reason behind the stepping stones of the FDA. It was in 1906 they passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required manufacture of these products to include the ingredients associated with the product. And so there was an evolution from that point, from 1906 to 1938. And then there was another circumstance that happened in 1938. There was a chemist in Tennessee that thought, hey, for us to sell more product, we need a solution form of this. So they used a solvent that contained diethylene glycol, which is something that is included in antifreeze. And based again, once on my toxicology days, this is a toxic alcohol. So the product was then sold with the solvent in place and actually led to several hundred deaths associated with this particular product. So after that happened in 1937, there was additional legislation that was passed, the Federal Drug and Cosmetic Act, which required safety of these medications to be evaluated prior to their approval.
This is less than 100 years ago, everybody.
Yeah.
And we're talking about people putting antifreeze into their bodies and then doping up their infants and babies. And here we are today talking about gene therapy.
Yeah.
And the chronic disease management epidemic that's in the United States today. But we had humble beginnings as a country in terms of the regulatory environment, right?
Right. And this was just safety. So for about 25 years, all that was required for drugs to be approved, there were about 4,000 drugs that were approved during that time frame, was safety. There was another potential concern that occurred, and it was more of an international concern, is the concern around thalidomide.
Yeah.
Bradley, how much do you know about the thalidomide birth defect cases?
This is something that someone was born with underdeveloped arms and legs. A lot of times they'll call it seal arms, where honestly it looks like your hands are attached to your trunk of your body. And it's obviously a cosmetic defect, but I think the interesting thing is the reason why it was a defect is the reason why thalidomide happened to be approved. It was approved and marketed for morning sickness for pregnant people.
Morning sickness, right, as a tranquilizer, as a sleeping medication. What's interesting about it, though, it was marketed and approved internationally. It wasn't here in the States. There was some providers here in the States that got samples of drugs and they gave them to their patients. And I think we had a handful of cases of these defects occurring. But if we look across the pond, there were 10,000 to 20,000 babies that were impacted secondary to the approval of this drug without having the necessary safety and efficacy information in place. And so one of the leaders, this Dr. Kelsey, which was also a graduate researcher on the thalidomide case, held up the approval of this particular medication. At the time, it was Kevadon, is what the brand name thalidomide medication was. Kevadon, from pretty significant pressure from the manufacturer to have that approved here in the States, and she didn't feel comfortable approving based on some of the commentary of the manufacturer saying that there wasn't scientific data to support the efficacy of the drug that she found, in addition to the fact that this group of researchers that did the research on Kevadon also had published some other questionable information. So she really went with her gut on that, and it prevented a significant health risk for many kids here in the States, right? That could be very reflective of what we saw overseas. So that was really, that led to the passing of an act in 1962 that not only required safety, but also efficacy moving forward. So they had more strict considerations and reporting around safety because of the thalidomide case. And then moving forward, drugs had to show efficacy.
You mentioned there was some pressure from the manufacturer, and the manufacturer determined what they considered effective.
Mm-hmm.
So How has the FDA process since then? How do they prove something's effective? What type of trial processes are in place to make sure that what we ingest or what we happen to take in infusion or injectable, what is out there that causes us to feel a little bit level of comfort?
Yeah. So I think that's a fantastic question, right? And I don't want to delay. I don't want to kick the can down the road, but I think it's important for us to kind of walk through the clinical trial phases initially,
Okay.
right? And then what type of trial do we kind of consider the gold standard when it comes to truly proving or disproving the efficacy of particular medications and safety of particular medications? And so I think it's best if we kind of walk through the clinical trial process. And when I was in pharmacy school, I learned a lot about phase 1 trials, phase 2 trials, phase 3 trials, and phase 4 trials.
Mm-hmm.
What was a new one to me was phase 0 trials. Do you know much about phase 0 trials?
Honestly, there's not a lot to know about it, other than it's kind of like the microscopic stuff. It's only been around for maybe 18, 19 years or so.
Yep.
And the goal is to really look at a new untested drug. Think of it as a chemical composition. A lot of times you'll only study it with less than 20 people. So it's almost like a case study. It's very small, almost like a case study, but it's for a new drug. It's almost like an experimental type of drug. I would say that maybe some of the gene therapy drugs might actually come into this a little bit or something like that. But you have to be, but that's what I would think.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you're trying to make sure that you're not going, it's still safety and efficacy, right? So these phase 0 studies are trying to get the healthiest of the healthy of the healthy, and they're giving them micro doses. What is the smallest dose to see when you might have a little bit of a change that could be considered harmful?
Right. And what it allows for a manufacturer, these phase 0 trials and why the FDA has approved them, it helps the manufacturer get a better understanding if it's worth pursuing this potential drug or treatment in a clinical trial based on early results of a phase 0 trial. So they can do this in a handful of individuals. They can complete this in several weeks. There's not a lot of financial impact to the manufacturer associated with this drug. And it gives them an idea of, we're going to put this drug through clinical trials. What is our possibility of actually getting it approved? Because if we think about drugs in general, when it comes to the success rate of medications once they go into clinical trial, only about 10% of them are actually approved, make it all the way through to FDA review and approval.
Wow.
So it helps to kind of expedite that, and it allows them to focus on lower risk opportunities. So once they advance from the phase 0 trials, they see that there's some signals that are triggered that this may be effective moving forward. They move into the phase 1 trials, right? So this is really safety focused, healthy population, relatively small population still, right? 20, 50 individuals.
But
maybe.
bigger than phase 0.
Yeah, but bigger than phase 0. It also is more costly than phase 0. So if we think of the costs associated with this, depending on the articles you look at, this could be anywhere from $1 million to $6 million in the phase 1 trials. And that generally lasts about 6 months, maybe 9 months. They advance then onto the phase 2 trials. Larger population. This is a population with the condition or disease, right? A little bit larger population, depending on the indication, of course. What I mean by that is, depending on how rare the disease is, you may not have a very big population to begin with. But a phase 2 trial looks at a small population with the disease, looks at safety and efficacy, right? A bit longer, year and a half. It's about $10 to $20 million. Once a product, if it makes it past phase 2, then it goes into phase 3. So these are large trials that we know more about, right? So these are potential thousands of patients associated with these trials. These could be years for them to complete these trials. Larger, more diverse population, right? They're really looking at the utilization of these drugs over a longer period of time to get an idea of what does this mean for long-term utilization of a drug like this. These trials ultimately are more expensive, right? Anywhere from $20 to $100 million, this part of the trial. So that would be our phase 3. And our phase 3 trial, if we think about study design, right, and throughout this, is we like trials that are randomized. What I mean by that is that we understand that the treatment or the non-treatment is random in nature, so there's no biases there. We like trials that are blinded or double-blinded, so neither the physician or the patient knows they are receiving medication, right? And we like relatively large and long trials as well.
Absolutely.
So that helps us to get an idea of, based on the length of the trial, how the trial was designed, the population that was studied, and then also the endpoints of evaluation. And when I say endpoints, as pharmacists talk, but goals of the trial, right? Is the goal of this trial to evaluate a reduction in your blood sugar? Is the goal of this trial to evaluate a cancer medication and extending your overall quality of life? That would be an endpoint. So those are the types of things that go into account when we talk about, the puts and takes of the FDA approval process and some of the things we like to check boxes on when we look at what we believe is a true effectiveness of a drug.
So, Tom, just a quick question for you. You mentioned endpoints or goals of a study. Who determines what that endpoint is and who validates whether or not that's really meaningful? I think in a lot of some of the conversations we've had earlier this year on GLP-1s and for weight loss, and I think you and I have talked about, is 5% weight loss, is that really a good number? Yes or no? So how do they pick these endpoints and who decides, is this really meaningful or not?
Yeah, so there's meaningfulness, right? When it comes to meaningfulness, that's always something that I've kind of wrestled with, because we oftentimes in these trials say they're statistically meaningful. What we think we need to really shift towards, and what comes up more often, is the clinical meaningfulness behind this, right? Clinical significance. So is, for a blood pressure medication, is a 2-point reduction clinically meaningful? It may be statistically meaningful, but is it clinically meaningful? And those are the things we need to wrestle with, right? And understanding what is clinically significant. And we have benchmarks out there, depending on the disease state, what we consider clinically significant versus statistically significant. So we use those benchmarks to get a better idea of the outcomes of this trial. I mean, how applicable and how much of a enhancement secondary to the trial do we see compared to other treatments in the category today? The difficulty with kind of getting an idea around clinical significance versus statistical significance is it's maybe difficult to truly understand the clinical significance in a relatively short trial.
Yeah.
So you're going to get some surrogate endpoints, right? So this oftentimes happens in oncology or cancer trials, where ultimately the goal is for these new treatments, is it extending a person's life? Is it increasing or bettering their quality of life? These trials are often not long enough to support that information, right? And there is a opportunity to get these products to market sooner rather than later. And so we're utilizing surrogate endpoints to get these drugs approved, with the hope that these surrogate endpoints, such as they use progression-free survival in cancer clinical trials, where they look at the patient's cancer prior to drug, after drug, there's a response to the therapy. How long does it take for the cancer to come back or grow, right? And so that's one of the surrogate endpoints that they utilize, is progression-free survival. But there's the risk that this progression-free survival doesn't actually correlate to an increased overall survival. And that's one of the endpoints. That's the more clinically significant endpoint that we should be asking for.
And I think one of the things that's interesting as we talk about endpoints, whether they're primary endpoints or primary goals, secondary goals, or even a stepwise approach to what we think, and I saw it would be a primary goal. That's the surrogate endpoint. But part of these studies also give us some unique information in terms of what to expect that's negative, right? Side effects. That's part of the process, is really understanding what am I going to get, what am I liable to expect as a patient using these medications. And I can only imagine that for these, you might have some people discontinue. And sometimes the side effect profile can be so much that you just stop the trial. And that happened before. So I can imagine that you have, to your point, only 10% actually make it to approval. So 90% fail. So there's a lot of money involved here, right? For trial and failure to try to bring something to market. So can you talk a little bit about what that means from a cost of bringing drugs to market, the trial and failure, and the all approach?
It was an article published by Tufts that is a research and development organization, and they have a price tag for from the initial clinical identification all the way through the FDA approval process of the cost of the research and development being anywhere from $2 billion to $4.4 billion. Huge number, right? The concern I have is there's some independent research out there, and there's a big delta between the independent research that puts the cost of research and development a drug, and it varies based on drug class and the type of indication that you are studying to treat, but it could be as high as maybe $780 million.
Well, if you're the manufacturer bringing something to market, what are you going to go with whenever you're deciding where to put a price tag on this?
Oh, right. So you're going to say that it's closer to $4 billion. Now, not to say that manufacturers ultimately don't make up the money that they spend. And this is an example that, of course, it's one end of the spectrum. But if we look at Humira, right? Since Humira was studied and approved early 2000s to ultimately where we're at today, they're going to exceed $220 billion in revenue.
Sounds like they made that up.
So they've more than made that up. Now, that's the far end of the spectrum example.
But that's the golden egg, right? Is that
exactly.
there's a high risk and there's a potential high reward, but then you have some potential high risk and bust.
Yep.
And I know that I'll probably be asking you about that a little bit later in terms of a big bust, because there's one that comes to mind that I really want to ask you about and how it got approved. But I just can't believe $4 billion to $750,000. Are there any differences in how the trials are made up that justify that delta?
The issue is the Tufts article. They didn't publicize, didn't include which drugs were included. They didn't include the failure rate costs associated with these medications. They didn't include the potential for CEO salaries, stock buybacks, and dividend payments that, if you look at the report from the House Oversight Committee in 2020 or so, there was 14 manufacturers that spent more on stock buybacks and dividend payments than they did on research and development. So I think that it's the problem is when we have these types of reports without the necessary information from Tufts, for instance, without the necessary information, you lean towards games being played.
At the end of the day, they do bring good things to market.
Yes, no doubt.
But at some point, you ask yourself, are they protected too much from competition that allows them to ride the Humira gravy train for 20 plus years, right? So tell me about this type of protection that it seems like this is the only gig in town. How does it happen?
Are you leaning into the patent discussion?
Yeah, I really want to know a little bit more about patents. But
right, so I think that's an important call out, right? So this patent protection allows for a manufacturer theoretically, right? Just there's some caveats in place depending on the type of drug that's approved. If it's an orphan indication, may have to be extended. But if we think about patents in general, they're established in such a way they should last 20 years. So that's from once the chemical moiety or entity is filed with the FDA, it's 20 years from that point. If we think about Humira, that chemical entity was filed in the mid 1990s. It came off patent 2022. So their patent protection was about 30 years. Yes, the innovation is extraordinarily valuable, but the patient can't afford the drug. They're not going to see the results of the innovation.
And
So
and we can't expect the manufacturer to constantly give it away to
no,
everybody. That's not the expectation, right? So
and it really hasn't stemmed, right? So our drug development hasn't stemmed. We're approving about when I say we, the FDA is approving about 49 medications per year. And it's been pretty consistent since the 1950s. There was a little bit of a backlog in the mid 1990s when the PDUFA Act was passed, which allowed manufacturers to pay to the FDA to have their drug reviewed, which allowed the FDA to then bolster their reviewers. So it sped up some approval processes. But since that time, we've been approving about 50 drugs per year. The FDA has.
we have loved ones. These are people that
Yep.
that we want to be able to have treated, and I don't begrudge the manufacturer. Nobody typically begrudges the manufacturer for trying to help, but there's also the marketability and potential misalignment of incentives when it comes to profitability. That's unfortunately it is a part of our health system, and because the idea of needing to maintain profitability so that you can have relevance and innovate and things of that nature. Tom, I'm assuming there's some other things out there that manufacturers do beyond, you know, just going after this drug and trying to hit this market for Alzheimer's for that particular case. But what happens after it's approved? What are some of the things that they do to keep other people from competing with them?
One of them is evergreen, right? So evergreening is a practice by which just prior to a medication, let's take Prilosec for an example, just prior to the medication coming off patent and therefore a manufacturer saying we're going to have a significant reduction in our revenue streams, they may adjust the molecule just slightly, and it's what they did, and then come out with Nexium. So Prilosec is Nexium is Prilosec in a fancier capsule, or at least it was at the time. That's one of the ways they do that. So they manipulate the chemical properties just slightly, right? Another one is the utilization of transitioning administration forms, right? So you go from a tablet. So this a good example here is going from a tablet for a medication, Suboxone, right, which is used in addiction medicine. They went from a tablet to a film. So that film allowed them to extend their patent for an additional time frame, 10, 12 years. So those are a couple examples of the evergreening process associated with that. It happens quite often. It's interesting. We look at some of the information's out there that's in regards to the overall pool of patents that are filed with the FDA. 85% of them are for existing medications, which is one of the ways that they extend prevent the lack of competition is through this patent play. So the evergreening process, right, happens pretty frequently. There's the pay to delay process, which is something that I had a direct conversation about, and at the time I thought it was illegal. So I prior to, in a previous life, I worked at a health plan, and we had a particular medication that was used for mental health that was impactful to the clients that we were serving. And when I say impactful, it was costing clients a significant portion, right? So it was impactful to the overall spend. And I would meet with manufacturers, pharmaceutical representatives on a pretty frequent basis. And so I met with this gentleman that was a market access to this mental health medication. And I remember meeting with him, and he just seemed really down. So I asked him, why are you so down? Well, we're losing patent on this drug. It's kind of our main revenue source. I'm likely going to be looking for another job. And I was like, I tried to console him. I'm sure you'll find another job, whatever the case may be. But deep down, I was also thinking, well, good. My clients are not going to have to pay less for a medication, right? There'll be some benefit on that with the generic competition. So I remember it would have been about 6 months when that drug was supposed to go generic. And he gave me a call, and he was much more jovial. I was like, so tell me, what's going on? How are you? Doing well. And said, so did you find another place to work? No, I'm still here. Okay. All right. So you must have taken on another account. No, I didn't. Okay. We just paid generic manufacturers not to produce our drug. At the time, I was astounded. Like this shouldn't be something that could happen, but it does. It does happen quite often where they just what they term it as a pay to delay approach, where it just limits competition. You just pay manufacturers not to produce drugs. So I'm going to pay you not to do anything. And can you imagine a generic manufacturer saying no to that? Probably not.
Well, and how about this? What if you have a brand manufacturer that has a competing product and they're a little small biotech firm?
Right.
Hey, I'm for sale. Buy me.
Yep. Yep.
It's like, yeah, I'm for sale. Go ahead. So you talked about pay for play, evergreen.
So that's another piece of one of these opportunities to push out patent expirations. It's a citizen petition, and the FDA allows any citizen, so you or I, anybody could file a citizen petition with the FDA for them to about a particular medication in the approval process, and it requires the FDA to evaluate this request. But ultimately, what it does is it leads to a delay in the approval of the medication. And it's important to have this, right? So it's important to have these citizen petitions in place. But can you guess who was actually filing these requests? Do you think it was truly citizens?
It was not my grandmother.
No. So it was about 92% of these petitions that were filed by manufacturers.
That's a nice little end around, isn't it?
Yes, it is. They're just these additional loopholes, and there's some legislation that's recently passed. One of them is the pay to delay legislation. There's also historically been some delays around the innovator manufacturer not wanting to supply samples of a medication to the generic manufacturers to replicate the drug. And they've used some strategies around risk mitigation programs to allow for that to happen. So there's legislation around that to prevent the brand manufacturers continue to do that. I think for me, if we take all of this into account, right, data is extraordinarily important to me, right? It should be important to anybody utilizing these medications. And then competition.
Yeah.
We know competition is a necessity to help level set some of the costs associated with these medications.
Well, and I think that goes back to just kind of go back to the question that we talked about at the top of the call. We've gone through a lot. The whole FDA review process, some of the patent techniques of extending patents. And I think the audience can probably come to a very similar conclusion that I think you and I have, which is how did pharma companies decide what medications should they go after in their pipeline? So, Tom, I want to ask you that question again. What does it really come down to?
I would hope that it comes down to innovation and meeting unmet needs within the marketplace. That's what I would hope. Do I believe that's the case? Not currently.
I think partially. I would say a percentage is, but these are large companies, right? And so, one of the things that we try to do in our education is to discuss how the healthcare dollar is spent and the influence that are out there. Healthcare is not free, and innovation takes work, time, and does take capital. Tom, you talked about potentially up to $4 billion of spend on just trials, with 90% of those not even resulting in a product. So you're constantly having to make up. And the United States and the FDA we're well positioned as a global leader, because a lot of the things that we do, it subsidizes the rest of the world, right? In terms of the innovation. So our costs are high so that the world can actually benefit. So I thought that was just a really interesting piece for us to really come back to the question and see what is really driving. And I do think a lot of it, can be money, but a lot of it, to your point, Tom, is innovation of really, and trying to treat the right people and to create a better, healthier life for that individual. Of course, that's always the goal, because if you don't have a healthier life, nobody's going to buy your product. So
Yeah, and ultimately it's a balance between, right, the necessary innovation, right?
Yep.
And then the ability to support the cost of this innovation. So it's just finding a middle ground.
It's fine.
I don't think we believe at this point that the trajectory we're heading on today, I don't believe that you and I can sit here and say it's sustainable.
It's not. And I think there's been some wake-up calls in the last couple of years with regards to things. And, we talked earlier this year about some of the changes, relative to biosimilar, things of that nature, disruptors in the marketplace that are out there. So I think we're getting to a point where we're at a tipping point to turn in a different direction, to be more patient focused and less dollar focused. And I think we're getting there. So we've had a lot that we've talked about today. And Tom, I am much ill-equipped compared to you on a lot of this context with regards to clinical trials. So thank you for supplementing the majority of this conversation. To me,
I'm just glad to contribute.
It's great, awesome stuff. So just to kind of let our audience know, this is going to be our probably our last podcast for the year. Hopefully we can get it out in time and at the beginning for the year to start, or the end of the year. And our next topic, we're actually going to pivot over to discussing manufacturer's assistance programs. These are the accumulator protection programs or the copay maximizer programs, as well as foundational patient assistance programs, and how it can help plan sponsors and patients manage their prescription costs, or just know what the ins and outs are and the pros and the cons of. So that's going to be on our next podcast. So with the podcast wrapping up today, I want to tell everybody thank you very much. Certainly appreciate your support. I know Tom appreciates your support.
Please like and subscribe. Please submit questions. As always, Bradley, a lot of fun.
A lot of fun. Take care, everybody.